Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for Week 9. As always, they're intended for half PPR leagues, and we're going to start with the players I did not rank due to bye and injury. The Niners and Steelers are on bye, so no Deebo Samuel, Juwan Jennings, Pearsall, Jacob Coing, George Pickens, Calvin Austin, or Van Jefferson. None of them are ranked in this video. There's also some new additions to the injury report. Stephon Diggs out for the season, so is Christian Kirk. We know Godwin, Ayuk, Rashid Shaheed, Rashee Rice, and Marquise Brown also out for the season, but Nico Collins is out until Week 10. He remains on IR. Jamison Williams is suspended until Week 10, so he's not available. Mike Evans is out most likely for another week, so not expecting him back. T. Higgins did not play last week with a quad injury. I did not rank him. Not sure if he plays. Quentin Johnston has missed 2 straight games, so he's unranked. Adam Thielen has yet to come back from IR, so unranked at the moment as well. Allen Lazard also didn't play. Neither did Juju Smith-Schuster. Brandon Cooks and Josh Reynolds stay on IR, and Jalen Polk didn't play last week either. None of these players on the screen are ranked. Maybe some get back in the mix. I will update them on Saturday when I get all of the injury report news over the week. But for now, let's hop into the rankings where at number 1, I am trusting CeeDee Lamb as the best option. We drafted him as number 1 for a reason, and his stats last year after the bye were elite. Last week, in his first game off the bye again, he was lights out, 17 targets, 2 touchdowns, and that's 31 targets over his last 2 games. So the volume's going to be double digits every single week. He's averaged 12 over his last 4 games, and I could easily envision another 15 against Atlanta this week. It's a top 10 matchup. The Falcons won't stop him, and rest of season, now's the time where CeeDee Lamb will lock in. He will be the number 1 receiver rest of year. Time to dominate. So he is the best guy you can find. At number 2, I have Justin Jefferson versus the Colts. And the guys at the top of the list are all must start. So I won't spend too much time on them, but Jefferson has ranked as the wide receiver 7 over the last 4 games, an average of 15.8 points. And he has 5 touchdowns on the year with at least 8 targets, 6 catches, and 81 plus yards in every game since week 3. So he's a stud. The Colts are a bottom 10 matchup, but I don't care. In primetime, Jefferson will be elite. At number 3, I have Ja'Marr Chase versus the Raiders, who gets a bottom 2 matchup. The Raiders are actually locking up receivers very well this season. Really tough spot, only giving up 109 yards per game to the position. But Chase has 7 touchdowns in his last 6 games, and if T. Higgins is out for the second week in a row, then expect 10 plus targets. You're not benching Ja'Marr Chase. He's matchup proof, and he's been the wide receiver 1 over the last 4 games with 4 touchdowns, 96 yards per game, 19.3 points on average. He's a lock in your lineup. Number 4, another lock would be A.J. Brown versus Jacksonville, who gets an elite matchup this week. The Jags rank top 3 against the position, giving up over 33 points per game to opposing wide receivers. 179 yards per game, 7 touchdowns in the last 5 games. A.J. Brown will be fine. He will get back in the end zone right away. I'm not worried about it. Jags will not be able to stop him. So he's been the top 4 wide receiver the last 4 games, and I have him ranked at number 4. You're not benching A.J. Brown. Don't get cute. Number 5, I have Amon-Ra St. Brown at Green Bay, and the volume was a little annoying last week. They played with their food. The Lions were just toying with the Titans. So he only had 2 targets in that game, but he did score a touchdown, and that gives him 5 straight games with a touchdown this season. So St. Brown is a guarantee to find the end zone. In the last 4 games, while he's only the wide receiver 15 in points per game with about 13.5, I don't really read into it. I think he will bounce back in a major way. There's no way he only gets 2 targets for the second week in a row. Against the Packers, it's a legit matchup, though. Against Jair Alexander, not the best. And in his last 5 games, he is averaging 13.1 points per game. So that's basically what he's given you the last 4 games as well. And he only has 1 career game against the Packers with over 100 yards. So I'm not expecting his best game of the season, but he probably still finds the end zone. I still think St. Brown is a lock in your lineup. At number 6, Puka Nacua instantly becomes a lock in your lineup. Now that he's healthy, you have to start him. We drafted him first round for a reason. He's clearly the number 1 target in this offense. And although he hasn't played a full game this season, he is still averaging 10.4 points per game with no touchdowns in those 2 games. In week 1, he only played 32% of snaps. Last week, he only played 57% of snaps. So technically, he hasn't even played a full workload in those 2 matchups. And if these stats are emblematic of what you get over a full 4 quarters, then he's going to be the wide receiver 1 rest of season. These are his numbers overall. 13 targets this season, 11 catches, 3 rush attempts, 153 total yards, and 0 touchdowns. That's 20.8 fantasy points in 2 games where he didn't play more than 57% of snaps. So he'll get healthier as the weeks go by and be even more involved in this offense. He's a lock in your lineup. The Seahawks are also a top 6 matchup. Puka will dominate against them. So he played great last year against them, averaging 16.3 points per game. He's going to be fantastic off a little mini bye. He'll be fully rested. Puka is a must start. Number 7, Drake London remains a must start. He was not very good against Tampa last week, but it's really the fact that it was a road game against Tampa as opposed to a home game. The home road splits for London against the Bucs are a very serious trend. At least 120 yards per game at home, meanwhile less than 50 on the road. So that is what I am buying into, not the fact that London is bad all of a sudden. He will bounce back. I'm not worried about him at all. In his last 4 games, he's still averaging 16.1 points per game on 9+ targets. He'll be fine. The touchdown will come back to him. Kirk Cousins still trusts him. So London remains a top 10 receiver. I'm not overreacting to one bad game. Number 8, I have Terry McLaurin at the Giants. Terry in his last 4 games has been a stud. 14.9 points per game, and that includes a fumble. 7.3 targets, 5.8 catches, 98 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. He's very safe, and last week he went over 100 yards in a very bad matchup. So he is matchup proof, definitely a lock in your lineup, a true stud. With Jayden Daniels, you cannot take him out of your lineup. At number 9, I have Brian Thomas Jr. at Philadelphia, who is questionable for this game, and he does sound like he'll play. Originally, he was going to be out for 2 to 4 weeks with a chest injury. Now he's day-to-day, and if he's a rookie that's day-to-day on Wednesday, he should be playing on Sunday. So that's great news. I do expect him to suit up, and this year, he's been a true alpha, a phenomenon. As a rookie, he was immediately a great player, and in his last 4, averaging 14 points per game with a bad game against Chicago, but otherwise almost a touchdown in every single matchup. He is money in the bank. Brian Thomas Jr. is matchup proof. So if you have him, you cannot bench him. As long as he's active, I will be starting him against the Eagles. He's a top 10 option rest of season. At number 10, though, this might shock you, but I have Josh Downs at the Vikings, and right behind him I have Michael Pittman in the same game. But I do prefer Josh Downs. Joe Flacco prefers him as well. In 3 games with Joe Flacco, Josh Downs is averaging 15.2 points per game on 10 targets, 8 catches, 72 yards, and 2 touchdowns in those 3 games. He is lights out, a money in the bank type of player, and he also gets the best matchup on paper you can ask for. The Vikings over the last 5 games are the number 1 matchup, giving up 43.1 points per game to receivers on just under 18 catches per game, 221 yards per game, as well as 10 touchdowns to the position. So really the spot you want, a massive upgrade for anyone. And with Flacco at quarterback, you really trust this offense to get going. The receivers are far more valuable with Flacco at quarterback. And although Pittman sounds like he's the number 1 based on our memory from last season, Downs is playing better. Even last week with Richardson, Downs went over 100 yards and a touchdown. He had a deep house call against the Texans. So I trust Josh Downs. He's playing very well right now. I do trust him. He has gotten more volume and touchdowns than Pittman this season. And Pittman, I still think, is in your lineup. He's also playing very well with Flacco, averaging 13.9 points per game, a very good option, also with 2 touchdowns, about 62 yards per game. But less volume than Downs. The matchup is elite, so I'm definitely upgrading both players. I prefer Downs straight up. So I understand if you think it's crazy, but if you really look into the numbers, it is not at all. It's just the splits with Richardson compared to Flacco. So trust Josh Downs. He is a lock in your lineup this week. I think off the waiver wire, he will lead you to victory. But so will Pittman. I think Pittman's going to be great. This matchup's awesome. And in primetime, I think both players go off. I think Flacco, it will be a very good option at quarterback as well against the Vikings. At number 12, I think DK Metcalf is in your lineup this week. He is questionable at home versus the Rams. He did not play last week, but it sounds optimistic he will come back. There was a chance he'd play in week 8, and in week 9, I do expect him back on the field. In his last 4 games, he does have 2 fumbles, only 1 touchdown, but still 10.4 points. He's giving you 9.3 targets per game and 77 yards per game. The floor is very safe for Metcalf. And against the Rams, he's historically played very well, an average of 13.3 points per game in his last 5, with 3 touchdowns in that sample size. So I trust him. I think he will find pay dirt this week, and as long as he's on the field, Geno will send him the most targets. The ceiling is open for DK in this game. Number 13, I have Garrett Wilson versus Houston, who's been lights out the last month, an average of 16.4 points per game, but it's a little bit misleading because 2 of those games were without Davante Adams. One of those games, he had 21 targets, and that's a big reason why he's seen 12.5 over his last 4. So I'm not convinced he's this good in actuality, but in his last 2 games with Davante Adams, he's still giving you 11.2 points per game. He's been very efficient, 5 catches per game for 87 yards, but no touchdowns. So the ceiling is not as high, but the floor is definitely there. Garrett Wilson is playing just fine with Adams on the field. It really opens things up for him in terms of spacing. So love that for him. If you're still getting 8 or 9 targets per game, then 100 yards is not a bad bet to make. He's gone over 100 yards in 3 of his last 4 games. So he does remain the number 1 receiver for the Jets, and I'm still starting him at number 13. I still think he's in your lineup this week. At 14, I'm also starting Malik Nabers versus Washington, but I would have expected to rank him higher after his performance against the Commanders in week 2. He was elite, 18 targets, 10 catches, 127 yards, and a touchdown. He put up 23.7 points on the Commanders in week 2. However, they have really turned it around in the secondary. The first 3 games, they gave up 200 plus yards per game to receivers, as well as 9 touchdowns to the position. However, over the last 5 games, they have become the worst matchup you can find. Only 116 yards per game and only 1 wide receiver touchdown over the last 5 weeks. So a complete 180. They decided to bench the first rounder Emmanuel Forbes in place of Benjamin St-Juste. And with Mikey Sainristil, still the rookie out of Michigan, really stepping up, their secondary has been elite. Over the last 5 games, they rank as the worst matchup on paper in fantasy. So maybe it was just matchup driven. I'm not completely convinced. On the season, they still rank as top 8, but in the last 5 games, they are dead last. So I do downgrade him. I am buying into the recency of this matchup. However, he was so good the first time around. He's also getting so much volume, 12 targets per game over his last 4. Nabers is still a name I am starting. So he probably needs a touchdown to probably pay off at this rank, but it's definitely possible. I wouldn't completely write it off, but there is a world where the Commanders do shut down Daniel Jones and their secondary is all of a sudden elite. They definitely have the coaching that can turn things around quickly. So I worry about it. I would have ranked him top 3 if this was still the same great matchup, but at number 14, I am downgrading him. I'm a little worried, but if he plays well, he would be matchup proof. If the Commanders shut him down, then this is legitimately one of the most difficult matchups you can find. So a bit more of a learning week in this matchup. I think you're still starting him. I think you're toughing it out because he was so fantastic the first time around. At number 15, I have Tyreek Hill at Buffalo, who is questionable technically with a foot injury, but he did play last week with the same foot injury, and I do think he will be active. So if he's available, I think you are starting him. In 3 games with Tua, he only has 1 touchdown, though, an average of 12.6 points, but it is coming on 9 targets per game. So if that's what you get from Tyreek Hill, 9 targets, that's enough to keep him in your lineup no matter what. But he has been disappointing this season. Even with Tua, he's only the wide receiver 17 in points per game. So that's not what you drafted. He's not as elite as expected. And against Buffalo, he's never played very well with the Dolphins. An average of only 10.1 points per game, only 2 touchdowns in 5 games, 53 yards on only 8.2 targets. So his numbers in this divisional matchup do concern me. I do think it's a legit downgrade overall, but this season the matchup has been average. I'm not too worried about it, but he did not play well in week 2 when Tua played in most of that game. So I can't say I'm like dying to start Tyreek Hill, but the name value, his talent, and especially the draft capital, all the expectations that came with him entering the year, I still think keep him in your lineup. But I kind of feel too high ranking him at number 15. I wouldn't be shocked if he doesn't go over 10 points. But it's still Tyreek Hill. I still think I will keep him out there. At number 16, kind of a shocking rank, but Cedric Tillman versus the Chargers, I think is a must start. He looks like the clear number 1 target in the Browns offense, and it's a completely different team without Deshaun Watson, with Jameis Winston under center. They also trade away Amari Cooper, so everything you remember from them before last week can be thrown out. Now it looks like Tillman is their guy. Kind of shocking they didn't use him before trading away Cooper, but he's very talented. He's looking very good immediately. He's 6'3", 213 pounds with 4.54 speed. He actually comps pretty closely to a guy like Nico Collins. He's a little less athletic overall, but only 1 inch shorter, 2 pounds lighter, and about the same overall speed, according to Player Profiler. So if that's what you're getting, a light version of Nico Collins, then Tillman is legit. And through 2 weeks, I am trusting these numbers. 18.8 points per game is a little bit misleading, but 10.5 targets, 7.5 catches, 90 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. He's been the wide receiver 2 over the last 2 weeks. So I think he's a top 20 play. I do trust him. It is a bottom 10 matchup against the Chargers, but they have given up 5 touchdowns over the last 5 weeks. I still think he finds the end zone. And with Winston, there's plenty of upside down the field. So Tillman, the guy you want in Cleveland, a must grab off the waiver wire if still available. I have him in the subscriber league, and he is really helping me with some injuries on my bench. So happy to have started him last week. Wish he gave me the 100-yard bonus, but 99 yards, 2 touchdowns. I'll take it. Cedric Tillman, a lock in your lineup. Moving forward, at number 17, I have DJ Moore at Arizona. And in his last 4 games, even with 3 touchdowns, he's been kind of disappointing. Only 10.8 points per game, 45 yards per game. The volume is not quite there. And that could happen every single week. It's hard to bet on multiple Bears players actually paying off. Other than Swift, you don't exactly know what you're going to get from all of the receivers. So it could burn you again, but the matchup here against the Cardinals does rank top 10, and overall, I do think it's a good opportunity for DJ Moore to bounce back. But unless they completely ignore Keenan Allen or trade him, I just think there's too many mouths to feed to keep him safe to play every single week, knowing you're getting 10 plus points. There's just going to be some games where that doesn't happen. The floor is just not quite there. The ceiling, though, is still elite. As the number 1 receiver in Chicago, I still think you have to start him. The matchup's good, and inevitably the volume will come back. So hoping for a touchdown. I think it will hit this week, but DJ Moore, a little unsafe overall in Chicago. At number 18, I have Zay Flowers versus Denver, who gets a tough matchup against Patrick Surtain. Can't pretend like it's not a downgrade, but I still think you have to start him. While he does have 3 games this year with 4 or fewer targets, he also has 5 games with 9 to 12 targets. So when that happens, when the volume is in his favor, he is lights out. Although he only has 1 touchdown on the season, he's still averaging 13 points per game in his last 4 without a single touchdown to show for it. So 100 yards per game in the last month, that's a very high floor. As long as the volume is there Flowers is a key part of their offense, and the Ravens can score at will. So eventually the touchdown will hit. When it does, you're probably going to go over 20 points and be very upset if you decide to bench him. So I think you just take the risk that it could burn you. Even against Patrick Surtain, I'm still starting Zay Flowers. The volume has been too high to ignore, and I think he's earned must-start status. The trade for Deontay Johnson is interesting, but until we see it really impact him, I'm not going to expect it to happen. Deontay didn't play last week. I'm not totally sure he's active in this game. So for week 9, it might be irrelevant. We'll see what happens. After I see Deontay, maybe I'll change my opinion on Flowers, but for now, I still think he's a top 20 play every week. At 19 and 20, I have 2 Packers receivers back-to-back, Romeo Doubs and Jayden Reed versus Detroit, who I think are both must-starts because the matchup is top 4. The Lions are really bad in the secondary, giving up 33 points per game to wide receivers on average the last 5 games, 17-plus catches per game, 206 yards per game, only 3 wide receiver touchdowns, but still very, very high usage for opposing receivers against the Lions. They just gave up 140 plus yards to Calvin Ridley. So one of these guys is going to go off for a massive, massive game. Unless it's like Christian Watson, there is no way both players burn you. But if I was just picking between these two straight up, I would prefer Romeo Doubs for the sake of his floor. He has seen more targets over the last 4 games, an average of 7 targets per game. So he's looking like their number 1 receiver lately. Jayden Reed has fallen to less than 5 targets per game. And while he does get some work in the run game, definitely an explosive player, very high ceiling, he only has 1 touchdown in the last 4 games. An average of 8 points is nothing special. So I do prefer Doubs. He has been safer. This matchup, though, is too good to pass up. And I think both players are worth starting. I think both will go over double-digit fantasy points. And one of them probably goes over 20, unless Christian Watson is the bearer of bad news. If it pivots to Watson or Wicks this week, I will be livid. But it's always possible that happens. There is some risk. That's why they're not high-end top 20 plays. They're just barely inside the top 20. But against Detroit, really good matchup. I do upgrade them. I would still start both of these players in Green Bay, only if Jordan Love plays. That's the big contingent aspect of this ranking. If it's Malik Willis under center, they lose a lot of value, and I wouldn't trust them. But I am expecting Jordan Love to play. It doesn't sound like his groin injury is that serious, and in a divisional matchup, I think he'll tough it out. I think he'll be on the field against the Lions this week. At number 21, I have Cooper Kupp at Seattle, who has been playing really well when active. An average of 14.8 points per game this season, but obviously one of those games is skewed when Puka Nacua got hurt. He had 21 targets in that game, but then he didn't play a full game in week 2. It's kind of actually somewhat legit, but it's also very touchdown dependent. Last week, the touchdown was very important. It bailed you out from otherwise kind of a poor performance. He dropped several passes early in the game. There was some good defense on him, but still Kupp did not pay off as I expected. I also did not envision Puka playing last week, so my expectations were incorrect on this overall offense. I was too high on Kupp last week, but he was still okay thanks to the touchdown, and I do think it probably returns to him against Seattle this week because the Seahawks are a very good matchup. In their last 5 games, they've given up 8 wide receiver touchdowns, an average of 33 points per game, and 166 yards per game. So I do think the efficiency will be there. I think Kupp could easily find the end zone once again, and there's always upside in this offense. The volume wasn't bad. He still got involved, but I do definitely prefer Puka Nacua. Nacua is their alpha. So Kupp is the backup, but in a top 6 matchup, I think he's a very high-end flex play. At number 21, I would recommend starting Cooper Kupp in week 9. At number 22, I'm also still starting Devonta Smith. He gets a top 3 matchup. The Jaguars cannot stop receivers at all. So Devonta probably finds the end zone again. Without it, he's offered a decent floor, though, this season. An average of 5.8 targets per game, 4.3 catches, 57 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Over the last 4 games, an average of 10.8 points per game. So although the volume is not where you'd love it to be, he does offer a decent floor. He has 64 plus yards in all but 1 game this season. So typically the floor is good for about 8, 9 points, and if he does find the end zone, you will be pretty happy. He will go over 15. So I do trust him. I do think he's a good option in this matchup against Jacksonville. The ceiling is safe to bet on. At number 23, I have Marvin Harrison Jr. versus Chicago, who I do think you're still starting, but in a tough matchup, I think is just a flex play. However, last week, I downgraded in a tough matchup as well against Jalen Ramsey, and he paid off. He went over 100 yards. He was great, and he definitely calmed some of your nerves because he hasn't been that consistent this year. In his last 4 games, still only averaging 10.3 points, but the touchdown is often there for him. And if last week was emblematic of him like turning a corner, I would trust him in my lineup rest of season. But he gets Jalen Johnson of the Bears this week, and that is a downgrade overall, but it's kind of more so a test. He played really well last week, so I'm willing to trust him one more time. And if he plays well again, he'll probably be matchup proof rest of season. So his talent will win out inevitably, but he's still a rookie. There is some concerns that he won't actually play well. We've seen Brian Thomas Jr. have a bad game in this matchup in the past. So a little worried about it, but still trusting him. Last week was very encouraging against the Dolphins. At 24, I have Calvin Ridley versus New England, and I'm not convinced he's the safest bet, but last week without DeAndre Hopkins, he was phenomenal. 15 targets, 10 catches, 146 yards, no touchdowns, and a fumble, but still 17.6 points was great. Against Detroit, it may have just been the matchup. Obviously, they were trailing big time in that game, and he didn't find the end zone, so it's not like he had the best game possible. But still, 15 targets is undeniable. That is a very safe floor if it repeats. The matchup is not as good, though, against the Patriots. It could come back to haunt you. In his last 4 games, Ridley is still only averaging 6.6 points per game. That's wide receiver 48 in points per game. So very risky. He could be terrible, but I do think that Rudolph is good enough to lock onto one player and keep Ridley viable just based on volume. So he's clearly their number 1 receiver. There's no more Hopkins on the team. They also paid him a shit ton of money this offseason, and they put their money where their mouth is. He's clearly their best weapon in the passing game. So the volume could easily repeat. If it does, he becomes a immediate must start, but I think after last week, he's at worst a high-end flex play. I still think you're starting him because the volume is too high to ignore. So Ridley, a pretty good option, but if he burns you, if he falls back down to earth, I wouldn't be that shocked. Last year, he was very inconsistent as well with the Jags. So hoping it maintains, but he probably is good for at least 80 yards in this one. I think the floor will be fine. Number 25, I have Chris Olave at Carolina, who should see 10 plus targets without Rashid Shaheed on the field. He would be the clear alpha in this offense, but it's still dependent on Derek Carr getting the start or not. If it's Rattler under center, he will be falling down these ranks, but I do think Carr is getting healthier. I do think he'll be back this week. So I do think Olave will be just fine. In his last 5 games against the Panthers, though, he is giving you 11.6 points per game on 8.6 targets, 5.2 catches, 66 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. That's kind of identical to what he's done over his last 4 games, an average of 11.8 points per game over the last month. So if you're hoping for a touchdown, it probably happens, but it's not a guarantee. I still think the floor is fine for about 10, 11 points. That should happen, even if Rattler is the quarterback. So I think he's a good flex play. If Carr does get the start, I'll probably upgrade him a few spots, probably right above Cooper Kupp. Olave would be a safer play in that situation. But even with Rattler, I think he's a fine flex play. At number 25, I think he's in your lineup this week. At number 26, I have Darnell Mooney versus Dallas, who feels kind of weird to rank him this high all the time, but he's consistently been one of the best flex plays this season. He deserves some credit. He's completely turned around his career in Atlanta. All it took was a good quarterback. So kudos to Mooney. He's very impressive in his last 4 games, averaging 14 points per game on 8.8 targets. It is sustainable with 3 touchdowns. He is the wide receiver 12 in points per game over the last month. So love what I'm seeing from Darnell Mooney. I think you will continue to start him. If you have him, he's definitely a top 30 play every week. At 27, I have Xavier Worthy versus Tampa, and he gets a very good matchup. The Bucks, ranked tied for 4th, they're a top 5 matchup this season. They give up 33.1 points per game over their last 5, an average of 12.8 catches, 163 yards, and 8 wide receiver touchdowns over the last 5 games. So I love this matchup for Worthy. While he did not hit on the deep touchdown I was expecting last week, he still found the end zone, and that gives him back-to-back games off of the bye with 8 targets. So he is definitely getting involved. He is their number 1 target at the moment, and this volume will keep him viable as a good flex play rest of season. Although DeAndre Hopkins will get more involved as the weeks go by, as he gets more acclimated in Kansas City, I still think Worthy has the most upside overall. He also has the most pre-existing chemistry with Mahomes, so I don't see his target share going anywhere. I think Worthy will be safe for 8 targets every week. And if that's what you're going to get with his upside and speed, you definitely have a flex-worthy option on your team. So he's going to consistently be ranked top 30. I think in good matchups, I will rank him top 20. If he finds the end zone this week against Tampa, then he will earn my trust the rest of the way. At 28, I have Ladd McConkey at Cleveland, who I'm ready to trust, but just want to see it one more time. McConkey has been very good over his last 4 games, 13.7 points per game, but that does include 2 touchdowns last week. It's not guaranteed to hit all the time, but 7 targets is a safe floor. 5 catches for 67 yards is his average. I think he's a bit bust proof moving forward. So I like this matchup as well. The Browns ranked top 7. They've given up 8 touchdowns to the position over the last 5 games. However, 2 of them were rushing touchdowns. So a little misleading, but still a good matchup on paper. And for that reason, I am starting McConkey in my flex this week if I have him. Top 30 is worth a start in my opinion. And for the Chargers, he has definitely been their most consistent target overall. So the floor is pretty safe every week. I think 9 points is about guaranteed. And if he does find the end zone again, you'll be very happy. He will go over 15 points. So Herbert is throwing it a lot more lately. And if Ladd is his best target, it does make him legit. At 29 and 30, I have Khalil Shakir and Keon Coleman back-to-back versus the Dolphins. And if Amari Cooper is ruled out, if he doesn't play, I'll probably bump both of them up inside the top 25. But until we know that for sure, Cooper does cap their ceiling. But it appears that these two are the better options in fantasy, at least at the moment. Cooper is not quite good to go, and they have seen more targets than Amari since he's joined the team. In the last 4 games, Khalil Shakir is averaging 9.1 points per game, but has not found the end zone. 9 points represents his floor, so he is bust-proof. He's a very good option. Meanwhile, Keon Coleman has found the end zone twice and is giving you 11.4 points per game. His floor is about 8 points per game. So really safe with both of them. They're both seeing about the same volume. While Shakir is a safer bet to catch his targets, they're more so checkdowns, and Coleman is a better deep threat in this offense. So a little higher upside with Coleman, but a safer floor with Shakir. I think both of them are very good flex plays in this matchup. It does rank bottom 5. The Dolphins are no joke. They only give up 22 points per game to the position on average, with only 3 touchdowns over the last 5 games. So a little bit of risk here, but I think in the Bills offense, there's way too much upside to ignore. I love the progress we've seen from Coleman as well in his rookie season. So he might be emerging as their number 1 pretty soon, but I think both him and Shakir are on equal footing. I think while there is a bit of downside, always some risk in this offense, the upside keeps them very, very valuable, and I would love to start them. I try to fit them in if I can. They have a lot of potential, and you could regret benching them if you pass up on it. But the fact that Amari Cooper and Dalton Kincaid and James Cook are in that offense, it does pivot from player to player any given week. So the touchdown's a bit random, but I think both of these players are pretty safe, especially with Cooper banged up. At number 31, I think Jakobi Meyers is also a pretty safe floor play because he's getting a lot of volume, 8.8 targets per game over the last 4. That's given him 11.9 points per game. He's also scored 2 touchdowns in that sample size, and Jakobi's clearly their number 1 receiver in Las Vegas. Brock Bowers is definitely better than him, getting more volume overall, but he also draws some attention away. Myers is fine, but he's not a flashy player. You don't feel like excited with him, but he is underrated and the floor is very high. He is bust proof as long as he's active. So the matchup against the Bengals does rank top 11. It's not a downgrade at all. If he finds the end zone, you're going to be very happy, but even without it, he's always a decent flex play now that Adams is gone in Vegas. Number 32, I have Courtland Sutton at Baltimore, who gets an elite matchup here. The Ravens rank top 2 against the position, allowing 41 points per game overall to receivers. 219 yards per game along with 9 touchdowns over the last 5 weeks is a massive upgrade for Sutton. So while he is a hard player to trust, last week he did go over 100 yards, but he also put up a bagel against the Saints 2 weeks ago. So there's a lot of volatility with Sutton. It's hard to fully trust him, but he is giving you 7.9 points per game over the last month, and that includes the bagel. When he does show up, he's usually involved, especially in the red zone. He usually goes over 50 yards and a touchdown when they get him going. So I think this is a good matchup for him. Definitely a spot where I'd like to start him, but I understand if it just feels too risky. In the Broncos offense, there's rarely many touchdowns available in the passing game. So I do worry about that. Bo Nix is not the safest investment, but Sutton gets such a good matchup here. I do think he's worth a start against the Ravens. Players usually go off. So if he has a Cedric Tillman type of game, you're going to get 2 touchdowns here. It's always possible, but if you get less than 5 points, you're also not going to be shocked. Buyer beware, but I do think Sutton deserves a low-end flex consideration in Week 9. Number 33, I have Tank Dell at the Jets, and given that Stephon Diggs is out and Nico Collins is not playing, you know there's a lot of volume headed for Tank Dell. You would expect that to make him a must start, but he has been bad this season, very untrustworthy. In his last 4 games, only averaging 8 points per game, and that includes 2 touchdowns. So without a touchdown, you're only getting 5 points. And last week, he was gifted a touchdown. Anthony Richardson threw a terrible interception at the end of the second quarter. The Texans got a free possession that they shouldn't have had, and Stroud turned it into a touchdown for Tank Dell. So that bailed you out. Without it, he would have been bad once again. And I really worry about this matchup. Against Sauce Gardner, he could get shut down. The Jets rank as a bottom 3 matchup overall. While they have given up 4 touchdowns to the position, less than 20 points per week, and only 107 yards per game to receivers. So I really worry about this matchup locking him up. I don't see a ton of volume. I think the Jets will force Stroud to beat them with anyone other than Tank Dell. So I worry about his actual catch percentage in this game. I worry about the target volume as well. I think he could easily burn you, and without a touchdown, I think it will be bad. So although the volume should be there, I view him as less valuable than Courtland Sutton because the matchup is elite for Sutton. Against the Ravens, it's top 2. Against the Jets for Dell, it is bottom 3. So matchup is very important here, and on Thursday night, I don't think Tank is a must start. At number 33, he's a low-end flex play. You're probably going to start him, but he's very close to the fence where you would bench him. I don't think he's a must start, just a interesting upside option this week. At 34, I think upside is also the name of the game with DeAndre Hopkins versus Tampa. The matchup is top 5. The Bucs are terrible in the secondary. They've given up 8 touchdowns over the last 5 games to receivers. And Hopkins was not really involved in his first game with the Chiefs, only 3 targets, 2 catches for 29 yards. So I apologize, I did rank him a little too high last week. But at some point, the upside will hit. I'm not convinced he's going to be getting more targets than Xavier Worthy, but the chemistry will get better as the weeks go by. And at some point, we will see a blow-up game from Hopkins with Mahomes. So it could definitely happen this week. The matchup is elite, and it's undeniable that Hopkins has upside in the Chiefs offense. So it's just a matter of time. I think he's still a very valuable depth piece, but over the last month, he has been terrible in fantasy, 3.9 points per game, but most of them did come with the Titans. So at 34, he's also on the cusp, just like Tank Dell. There is some risk here, but there's also a very easy path for success. I still think Hopkins is a decent flex play this week. At 35, kind of the cutoff point, the last decent floor play I could find would probably be Tyler Lockett versus the Rams. Lockett has been safe the last 4 games, only 1 touchdown, but 8 points per game. That's a decent floor in general. So I don't think he burns you. I think he will put up top 40 numbers at the position. However, the ceiling probably isn't elite. In his last 5 games against the Rams, though, he is averaging just under 11 points, 10.9, with 2 touchdowns in that sample size. I think he will be a safe option. I definitely prefer Metcalf, but on the season, Lockett has been better than JSN. And although he was very bad last week in the rain, I don't really care too much. They locked him up pretty easily. Geno did not play well, so I kind of throw that out. With Metcalf back on the field, Lockett will get open more easily, and he should have a solid floor in this game. So at 35, I think he is the number 2 receiver in Seattle. I'd be willing to trust, but at this point, I'd probably just keep him on the bench. I think this is the cutoff point. Moving forward, you are just praying for touchdowns, and the risk is a bit too high for me to endorse. But Xavier Legette will be the number 1 receiver in Carolina moving forward, at least until Adam Thielen comes back. Maybe he's not better than Thielen right away, but over the course of the year, he will start to emerge as their top target in Carolina. And usually that does lead to 1 touchdown for these receivers in the Panthers offense. And if Legette is the guy, it's probably going to go to him. He also has 3 touchdowns in his last 5 games. So we're going to see that horseback riding celebration several times rest of season. And I do think he offers an interesting ceiling rest of year. But over the last 4 games, a tough floor, only 6.1 points per game. He's very touchdown dependent overall. But last week, he did get 7 targets, 4 catches, 34 yards, and a touchdown without Deontay Johnson. He was not healthy enough to play, and that is probably what you should expect from Legette moving forward, about 7 targets per game, if not more. But the matchup against the Saints is not great. Lattimore is usually a downgrade, so I do worry about it, but on the season, it has been a top 8 matchup. The Saints might give up another touchdown to Legette here, so he should be okay, but I kind of want to see it before I fully trust it. With Thielen maybe coming back, there is more risk as well. So it's kind of dependent on Thielen remaining on IR for this ranking. If Thielen is activated, I will bump down Legette and probably have them both back to back around wide receiver 42, 43. They will not be as safe for sure. It's possible that Thielen is the guy you want. So buyer beware with Legette, but still rest of year, he's probably a decent depth piece to have on your bench. At 37, I'm not ready to give up on Rome Odunze, but obviously you are running out of patience with this receiving core. Odunze in his last 4 games is only averaging 5 points per game, no touchdowns, and he only has 1 good game on the season. Last week, though, they did try to get him involved. He was the number 1 receiver for their offense, but he didn't put up great numbers, only 8 fantasy points, but he was better than DJ Moore. So maybe now that we're past the bye, the role for him does expand as the weeks go by. I still have faith in him, but only in good matchups can you feel like somewhat hopeful for the ceiling to hit. This is a good matchup, though, against the Cardinals. It does rank top 10, and it is possible this is the week against another elite rookie wide receiver. So maybe him and Marvin Harrison go back and forth, but until we see Odunze really pay off consistently, I think it's just a bit too risky to bet on. At some point, though, he will blow up. I'm not ready to write him off. I still have him as an interesting low-end flex play, but at 37, I think you're probably keeping him on the bench. It's a little bit too risky to trust. At 38, I have Amari Cooper versus the Dolphins, who is questionable, not practicing on Wednesday. He might not play, but if he does, the upside is definitely there. Kind of hard to trust in this offense on a weekly basis, but Cooper was traded for a reason, and he did score a touchdown in his debut. So it could always come back to him. He could be the leading target over Shakir and Coleman any given week, but he has been kind of bad the last 4 games, only averaging 7.4 points, but 2 of those games were with the Browns. So some interesting upside, but if he's injured, if he's too banged up to play, you probably won't start him. I'd probably keep him on the bench. Even if active, I'd rather go with Shakir and Coleman. At 39, though, another player that was recently traded for, Davante Adams versus the Texans, is not a safe play on Thursday night. I don't think you have to put him in your lineup. He's only averaging 9.9 points per game, and a lot of those stats come with Las Vegas. So he has not been very good with the Jets, only 6 points per game in those 2 games this season, and he is not safe in your lineup at all. But he's so talented, there is always room for that potential to pay off. So I'd keep him on the bench, but I understand if you're desperate enough to start him, there is always some appeal with Adams. Same applies with Jordan Addison, always some appeal with him, but you're just hoping for the deep touchdown to hit. The volume is very shaky for Addison, less than 5 targets per game, And without the touchdown, he does burn you pretty consistently. So last week was bad, only 2 catches. And while it could easily bounce back, if he does not score that touchdown, you will be disappointed. He will not go over 10 points. So the volume needs to be consistent for me to rank him top 30 every week. Without it, he is a low-end flex play. Good luck. You're going to need it with Addison. Number 41, I have Jalen Tolbert at the Falcons, who's been okay, but pretty touchdown dependent. Only 8.6 points for Tolbert in his last 4 games because of only 1 touchdown. So when it doesn't hit, you'll be disappointed. But in this offense behind CeeDee Lamb, he is the number 2 receiver for the Cowboys. So that is interesting, keeps him as a appealing dart throw option, but just a low-end flex play. Not trusting him overall, but the matchup is top 9. Maybe he gets going against the Falcons in this game, but it's also possible that Lamb just doesn't share those touchdowns at all. I still think Ferguson is the player they'd prefer to get going above Tolbert. So if he's the 3rd guy in the rotation, the touchdown's unlikely. He's just a swing for the fence, nothing else. Number 42, I have JSN versus the Rams, who doesn't offer much upside. Only 1 touchdown on the season for him, and only about 7 targets per game. He was the number 1 target last week, but didn't do much. Only 6 catches for 69 yards with no DK Metcalf. So that's what we expect from him, even with Metcalf on the field, and the volume has not been safe this season. I just don't trust JSN to actually pay off. Last year against the Rams, he was bad as a rookie, only 4.2 points per game, so nothing really special in this divisional matchup. I think without the touchdown, your patience is really running thin with JSN, and I'd keep him on the bench. I don't think he's a good start at the moment. I also do not trust Jaylen Waddle at Buffalo. He's not a safe play. The volume is just not safe for him. An average of 5 targets per game with Tua on the field. We would have expected that to be higher this season. So kind of disappointing with Waddle. No touchdowns either for him this year. And if you're only getting like 4 catches for about 60 yards, that's not enough. It's just only 8 points. While he might not burn you completely, you're never getting the ceiling you drafted, and you have to be pretty disappointed with Waddle this year. I would also be losing a lot of patience with him. I'd keep him on the bench this week. At 44, I would be trying to pick up Elijah Moore off the waiver wire. He looks like the number 2 target in the Browns offense now that they've moved off of Amari Cooper. They pay Judy more, but Elijah Moore over the last 2 games does have more targets overall. An average of 9 per game, 7 catches for 63 yards, but with no touchdowns, he's still putting up 9.8 points in those last 2 games. So if that's his floor, he's going to be a very good option. I kind of want to rank him higher, honestly, but I want to see it one more time. It's only 1 game of a sample size with Jameis Winston, and it could definitely move away from him right away. So it probably is even with him and Judy rest of season, but at the moment, I would prefer Elijah Moore. I think he has very interesting upside rest of season. If this floor continues, if you get 9 targets from Elijah every week, then you will probably start him in the same vein as a guy like Jakobi Meyers. So Tillman, definitely the guy I want, but Elijah Moore, I would prefer over Jerry Jeudy. And at wide receiver 44, I honestly feel too low in the rankings. If the sample size was bigger, I would probably rank him top 35. So a very interesting plug and play. If he finds the end zone, you will be ecstatic if you start Elijah Moore. At 45 and 46, back-to-back, I have Rashad Bateman and Deontay Johnson versus Denver. And Deontay was hurt, did not play last week. There's a chance he does not play again. But the Ravens did trade for him. He is now a Baltimore Raven. And that really messes with the target share in this offense because it was already crowded. There were some games where even Zay Flowers disappeared. However, Bateman definitely gets impacted the most. He might not be the safest number 2 play in this offense anymore. So it could definitely pivot to Deontay as the number 2 guy that you want. But Bateman has been pretty good over the last 4 games with 2 touchdowns, an average of 11.6 points per game. So he's still interesting, but I kind of just want to see what happens with Deontay before I trust Bateman. He's not as safe of a flex play if the offense is more crowded. So tough spot here against the Broncos. They could shut down Flowers, who will be matched up against Surtain. So somebody else could really be elevated. It's possible there's a great game here for a number 2 receiver in Baltimore. But if Deontay's healthy, I'm not quite sure who that will be. I think Bateman's more valuable in the short term, but rest of season, it will probably be Deontay who gets more targets. So I'm going to bench both of them at 45, 46, not safe enough, but there is some appealing upside with these receivers. At 47, there's also some upside with Darius Slayton versus the Commanders, but it has been the worst matchup on paper over the last 5 games. So I'm going to trust that, not as much trusting Slayton, but he has had some really high upside, over 100 yards last week, and in the last 4 games, an average of 11.3 points per game with only 1 touchdown. He has been pretty safe the last 4 weeks. So maybe he's overtaken Wan'Dale as the number 2 receiver you trust in this offense, but I still feel like you need a lot of luck with him. He's just a deep play waiting to happen. If he doesn't do that, you will get burned. So definitely worried about it. With Slayton, it's not safe enough to trust, but I would rather start him than Wan'Dale in the Giants offense. Number 48, I have Michael Wilson versus the Bears, who's been okay the last 4 games with 2 touchdowns, an average of 8.3 points per game. But without it, you're not getting even 40 yards. So Michael Wilson, definitely a liability. While he has been emerging in Arizona a bit more lately, he's still very touchdown dependent. I don't think he's a safe enough start just yet. At 49, I have Khalif Raymond at the Packers, who did step up last week a little bit, but their offense was very strange. Not something to really read into in that game against the Titans. So he will be the number 2 receiver this week without Jameson Williams, but I'm not quite sure what that means. It could turn into a shootout where he is very much involved. He could also be a complete non-factor like Tim Patrick. It's very difficult to trust him, but I would prefer Raymond over Tim Patrick. He has been better the last 4 games. He also has 2 touchdowns. That helps a lot. So Raymond, an interesting flyer, but not safe at all. I think I'd keep him on the bench. At 50, very interesting dart throw, but Christian Watson has undeniable upside. He's also played very well against Detroit. If you look back to last year in 2 games with Jordan Love against the Lions, he averaged 13.7 points with 2 touchdowns, a touchdown in each game. He also went over 100 yards in his last game with Aaron Rodgers as a rookie. So he has played very well against the Lions. He does step up in this matchup. So it's possible it happens again, but it's also very hard to bet on confidently. It could easily pivot to Dontavian Wicks as the number 3 option. Watson hasn't been getting a ton of targets either, only 3.3 per game in the last month. That volume is very unsafe to bet on. So I wish it was more consistent because there's a lot of upside with Watson this week. He could go over 20 points. I wouldn't be shocked if it happened. One of these Packers receivers will do that in an elite matchup against the Lions, but the volume's just not safe enough. I don't think you can start him, but if you are swinging for the fence, he is the name to go with this week. Christian Watson could pay off against the Lions. These last 10, I'm just going to rip through for the sake of the watch list, but very interesting players. I kind of want to rank them higher. They're just not safe enough at this point. Number 51, I have Josh Palmer at Cleveland, who is the number 2 receiver for Justin Herbert, who has been playing better lately, but Palmer has yet to find the end zone, and if Quentin Johnson returns, I don't trust his ceiling. At 52, I have Jalen McMillan at the Chiefs. Terrible matchup for him against Trent McDuffie, and he's just not experienced enough to trust. While the volume has ticked up for him the last 2 games, he's not very efficient. He's still a rookie with a lot to learn, and I just don't trust him. I think Cade Otton is the only receiver in Tampa to trust. At 53, I have Jerry Jeudy versus the Chargers, and it's possible he is better than Elijah Moore, but after the last 2 games with no Amari Cooper, he has been their 3rd receiver, but still getting involved. He is getting a decent amount of volume, but I don't trust him. I definitely trust Tillman, and I think Elijah Moore is more involved at the moment. So still kind of a wait-and-see mode for definitive clarity on the Browns receivers overall, but at the moment he has the least value. I'm going to pass on Jeudy, but he's an interesting pickup off the wire. It's possible not only is he better than Elijah Moore rest of season, but that he is actually more involved than Tillman. They do pay him the most, but I doubt he's above Tillman. For now, he is still behind Elijah Moore. At 54, I have Demario Douglas, who is the number 1 receiver for the Patriots. But against the Titans, if L'Jarius Sneed is healthy, there's no way I'm going to test it. I will definitely pass, especially if Drake May is out with his concussion. There's no upside with Brissett. At 55, I have Wan'Dale Robinson versus the Commanders, who looks to be moving behind Darius Slayton. And if that's the case, all you get is check downs with Wandale. Even if he gets like 7 targets, it's kind of irrelevant because you never get more than 40 yards with Robinson. So very touchdown dependent. No, thank you. I'll pass, but the floor isn't the worst overall. At 56, I have Keenan Allen at Arizona. It's a good matchup, but I think Odunze is poised to break out sooner than Keenan. I really worry about Keenan. I think it's a real waste of potential with him in the Bears offense. I really wish he could get traded because not only would it open up his ceiling, but also the ceiling for Odunze. So at the moment, I'm not willing to start him. Maybe he pays off, but I'm more interested in betting on Odunze than I am Keenan as the number 2 receiver in Chicago. And it's pretty unsafe beyond DJ Moore in the first place. So no thanks with Keenan. I'll pass. And I'll also pass on Demarcus Robinson, but it is tempting. He does have a lot of touchdowns with both of those receivers healthy alongside him. He's clearly the number 3 option, but Whittington was inactive last week. It's possible he loses that job, but he also scored 2 touchdowns. There's always some upside if you're just swinging for the fence with Demarcus Robinson. 58 and 59, a bit of a toss-up between Parker Washington and Gabe Davis for the number 2 receiver in Jacksonville. If Brian Thomas Jr. doesn't start, though, then they'd be up for grabs for the number 1 wide receiver in Jacksonville. So no Christian Kirk. There is some volume available. I think I prefer Parker Washington, but Gabe Davis does have the contract. Gabe Davis is more boom bust. Washington, slightly higher floor, but at 58, 59, I don't think I trust either of them in my lineup. You're just desperate, hoping for the best, more likely in DFS. But last player I will mention is Alec Pierce of the Colts. At the Vikings, it is the best matchup you could ask for in the last 5 games. And Pierce always has some upside. In week 5 with Joe Flacco at quarterback, he had 3 targets, 3 catches, 134 yards, and a touchdown, 20.9 points. But he can also give you a bagel. Alec Pierce is very risky, but the upside is undeniable. When he goes off, he is elite. So just wanted to mention him with Flacco under center. He's a bit more interesting in the Colts offense. These are my top 60 receivers this week, and I feel very good with starting the top 13. I think all the way through Garrett Wilson. I trust these players a lot. The matchup is not a downgrade in general, and if it is, they're matchup proof. I think you're getting at least 15, 16 plus points from the top 13 receivers. They should all play very well. But starting with Malik Nabers, I worry about the matchup, but the name value still keeps him viable. I still think 14 through 25, all the way through Chris Olave, you should probably expect 12 plus points. I do think those are the wide receiver 2s this week. Definitely players I am starting if I have. But starting with Darnell Mooney, we hit the flex conversation, and I think there's a lot of upside with these guys, but once we hit DeAndre Hopkins, Tyler Lockett, I think that is the cutoff point. I think at that point, I'm trying to bench those guys or just pivot to running back and play it safer. So hoping for a touchdown outside the top 25, it's still a decent bet to make. Until Tank Dell, DeAndre Hopkins, I still think you have a pretty safe floor and a good matchup to fall back on. So it gets very dicey following Xavier Legette, though. You're very much hoping for a touchdown. And I think once we hit Elijah Moore, Rashad Bateman, that is the true cutoff point. I think you have to be way too desperate to start those players. Only in DFS would I look for them as cheap contrarian options. So good luck to you. If you have any questions remaining, let me know in the comment section down below. I'll be happy to answer them. But if you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I will see you next time. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.